Hello. This is my first attempt to abandon the glitchy photo booth on my MacBook since it seems to be giving me corrupted video files randomly and I keep losing performances. So I'm going to try to recording an entire chapter at one time here and then downloading it and doctoring the background with video editing software after that. So here we go. Hopefully this works. Chapter 11, The Boy and the Black One. From several of the people, and through many evenings of talk and of storytelling, I have gathered together the parts of this story. I tell them now not as history, but as living memories which are woven, impartially, from the threads of legend and from threads of reality. Here are three such memories, and these recall 3 days from a year which is past, days that are linked together by the passage of time, by the spirit of the Black One, and by the recollection of men. To our eyes, the stories of the Helmut love to recount of the past must appear as creations of fantasy. But in the eyes of the people, these stories are the stuff of which life is made. It matters little whether things happened as they are said to have happened. It only matters that the 3 days I speak of were good to the people, who treasure their memories. The first day was a cloudless one in September. A steady south wind kept the glowing leaves of the dwarf willows in motion above the close-cropped lichens. A raven circled lazily over the river called Inuit Ku, alone in the sweep of the sky, playing and rolling in the wind like a leaf caught in an updraft of warm air. The raven could see more than the man, yet Hikwa knew without seeing that the tundra to the north had come alive and was moving. Pausing for a second because there are some actual photographs in the book here that I'll add to the backdrop when I make this an official upload. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 photos. Hikwa climbed carefully into his nervous kayak from an overhanging ledge of rock at the river's edge. With a few quick strokes of the long double-bladed paddle, he sent the kayak clear of the slack water and into the swift and steady flow of the river. The south wind carried the smell of cattle, and the rough banks of the river were scarred by deeply worn ruts, like the trails thirsty cows leave on the muddy banks of the placid woodland streams in the far south. The kayak drifted on towards the mouth of the river, where it emptied into Kakut Kumanik, and the stink of fresh manure grew heavier in the air. A strange water line ran along the shores, a wide band of pure white, set between rock and water in sharp contrast to the brown stream and the black rocks. This was a belt of hair, a solid mat of hair shed in the river during the passage of the deer, which had come that way in the space of a week. 100 yards short of the river mouth, the steep banks abruptly subsided, and the low rolling plains lay open to Hikwa's gaze. Now he thrust against the paddle, and the kayak fled into the backwater and hung there, rubbing its thin flanks on the edge of the rocks. Hikwa loosened the lashings of his deer spear and lifted the short-handled weapon until the arrow point just grazed his lips. Then he laid the spear across the thwart in front of him, satisfied that it was ready. He waited. 3 minutes, 4, then the deer came. They seemed to emerge from the rocky banks of the river, as if by some strange geological genesis. They came quickly to the edge of the water in single file, a fawn leading and agilely threading its way between the sullen shapes of the boulders. Hikwa moved no more than the rocks about him. He held the kayak in check against the overhang and watched steadily as the fawn reached the water, and, behind it, 100 deer crowded forward on the slope. The fawn stopped by the edge of the river and grazed idly amongst the harsh sedges, while the rest of the herd reached the bank and began to shoulder each other forward. Turning a startled look on the throng which pressed upon it, the fawn left the sedges and waded carefully out until the current caught it and swept it off its feet. Then, with head high and its minute tail erect, it struck off bravely for the opposite shore. Still, Hikwa did not move. He waited without motion until half of the deer had crossed and their great bucks who were in the rear had entered the water. Then the kayak leapt into the swift current like a dog unleashed, and in an instant he was amongst the swimming deer. With his left hand on the trailing paddle, Hikwa steadied the fragile craft, and with his right hand he gripped the spear at its balance point, lifted it high, and made his first thrust. His appearance had been so sudden that for a few moments the deer flow continued unbroken, but as the spear went home, the river of deer dissolved into clots and fragments. There were perhaps 50 beasts in the river when Hikwa appeared among them, and these gave way to panic. Some swam for shore, and when their feet were almost on the rocks, turned about and thrashed back into the dangerous center of the river. A doe plunged into eccentric circles while her fawn, borne under by the surging hoofs of a group of bucks, was carried lifeless downstream. With their massive antlers raking the air, the bucks turned and followed the drowned fawn toward the bay. Hikwa sent the kayak after the fleeing bucks. He closed with them in half a dozen strokes, but for the moment he made no effort to come into spear distance. Instead, he held the herd as a good cowboy holds a herd of beeves. Beeves. Oh, not familiar with that word. And the bucks swam ahead of him with all the strength they could muster, holding their heads half sideways to catch recurring glimpses out of the white, staring eyes of the pursuing thing. The hunter held them until a good mile of open bay separated them from the safety on all sides, and they were thrusting their weary bodies far beyond the river mouth. Then things were as Hikwa wished. Without effort, he drew abreast of the last buck in line. It shook its head, swerved violently, but could not avoid the flickering thrust of the spear. The spear barely seemed to touch the beast before it was withdrawn, and the kayak was gone, leaving the doomed buck to die. Hikwa killed with the ease and dexterity of a trained butcher, but with far less effort. Soon the herd of fat bucks swam no more, and the surface of the bay was free of all motion except where the wind ruffled the clear waters. Meanwhile, a raven had dropped steeply down out of the white sky until he was flying heavily above the dying deer back at the crossing place. But his hunger was held in check by the sight of three tiny figures approaching along the south bank of the river. Angrily, he circled over a doe, unwilling to acknowledge the approach of the woman, the boy, and the dog. Then they were close. The raven suddenly forgot his anger and towered steeply up from the rocks, and the boy's sling whirred like a grouse in flight. The smooth stone caught the raven on the bend of its outstretched wing and sent him spiraling wildly into the current of the river of men. Finished with the bucks, Hikwa turned back toward the river mouth. As he passed each of the floating deer, he stopped to hook the foreleg cunningly behind the antlers in such a way that the deer's nostrils were held above the water and the animal could not become waterlogged and sink. The breeze was rising, and it was brisk enough to make the kayak bound like a live thing. Hikwa bent forward over his flying paddle. Under the worn parka, his muscles ebbed and flowed until the kayak slipped above the river's grip, rising lightly above the touch of the fast water, and skimmed upstream to the crossing place. He was halfway there when he met the struggling body of the drowning raven. Hikwa grasped it swiftly and stuffed it into the cockpit beside him, then drove on and beached the kayak on the shore where his wife waited. Later that day, Belikari, the son of Hikwa, walked for many miles around the shores of Kakut's lake. Wherever he found the grounded carcass of a deer, he waded into the water, gutted the dead beast, and dragged it up on the land. If the hides were prime, he skinned them off with the skill of one who knows his work well. Then the naked carcass was quartered and placed in a hollow on a nearby ridge. Above the meat and around it, Belikari erected a bastion of great stones to hold the wolverines away. Atop the pile, he placed the antlered skull with the antlers still stretched against the pale sky, so that when the snows came, the dead deer would still signal its whereabouts to the man who had killed it. When Belikari returned to the night camp near the crossing place, the work there was nearly done. His mother, Iput, was squatting before the fire, carefully tending the iron pot she had carried on her back the whole 30 miles from Utek's lake. The pot was black with a thick soot of oily bones and scraps of fat meat, for inside the pot the fat was being rendered from the deer. The liquid fat bubbled silkily up to the rim as Iput threw in new strips of fine white suet, which she was stripping from a pile of meat beside her. Hikwa sat on the ridge by the river, surrounded by a towering, bloody mound. Brilliant red meat it was, caught in the driving crimson rays of the setting sun, which made the meat glow like the coals of a great fire. Hikwa saw Belikari and hailed him. "Come here, little belly," he called. "There is still much meat to slice while you spend the day walking pleasantly looking for duck eggs on the shore. Take these piles and spread them carefully upon the willow bushes and keep them clear of the ground." Grinning broadly at the jibe, Belikari went to help his father make the dry meat for the winter's food. At last they were called back to the fire by Iput, and the sky was dark above them. Now the three Eskimos had finished their meal, and night fell upon them. They spoke of the hunt which had passed, and there was laughter then, and singing afterwards. Iput bragged a little of the blocks of fat she had cooled and hardened in swaths of wet moss. Yet Hikwa and Belikari looked at her handiwork and pretended to find bits of bone and twigs in the sweet-smelling and flawless blocks. The fire died down, and as the boy Belikari sat staring into the coals, his father reached into his hunting pouch and brought out the beak and the talons of the raven. Hikwa had bound the bill and the feet in a tiny rawhide sack, and as Iput looked on with a frightened solemnity in her lined face, Hikwa sewed the things from the raven onto the back of his son's parka. Belikari turned a puzzled face to his father, and the old hunter spoke to him quietly by the side of the dying fire. "Son of Iput," he said, and he looked not at his son, but to the dark plains that stretched away to the north. "Son of Iput, here is a thing for you to remember all the days of your life. In the time that is yours, you will listen to the voice of the raven. When the raven spirit calls in the night, you will listen and do what the spirit says you must do. This day you brought down the raven, and the black one does not die as other birds die. In all of my time, I have not heard of a man who came close enough to the black one to strike him down from the air. I think this is a sign that the raven spirit will help you, has chosen to help you. So you must not again lift your hand to the black one of the air, but listen instead to the voice of the raven in the long hours of darkness, and do what his voice shall tell you to do." Hikwa finished speaking, but Belikari did not reply. He felt of the tiny packet sewed to his parka, and he was a little afraid. Later that night, when the three of them lay under a fresh hide by the failing warmth of the fire, he snuggled close to his father, and when an Arctic fox chose to bark from the hill, Belikari listened, and his heart thumped in his breast, for he was listening for the voice of the black one of the air. And so the first day of this story comes to an end. Beyond it lay the time when the snows came, and the river of men lay hidden under the sheath of white ice. The deer disappeared to the south, and Hikwa and his family gave up the skin tent by Utek's lake and built their igloo by the nearby lake where Elekahau, the lame one, had his winter camp. The snows grew deeper and cold sharper. Then one day Hikwa's neighbor, Elekahau, set out with his family to visit a distant camp of the people far to the north on the banks of the River of Men. The second of the 3 days tells of what came to pass during that journey. The short winter day was half over, and Alikahau was in a hurry. He waved the dog-driving stick over his head, and the tailbones of a wolf, which were tied to the stick, rattled loudly in the still air. The dogs heard and bounded forward again, and the 20-foot Komatik, the sled, creeped over the exposed black rock of a ridge and careened off into the snow-packed gully below. Kaluk, Elikahau's wife, sat on the sled with her children, her 6-year-old daughter, Kautuk, and her 3-year-old son, Kelaharuk. Elikahau ran beside his dogs on the upgrades, but on the downslopes he flung himself on the back of the Komatik, for he had a leg that was crippled from an ancient thrust of a wounded muskox horn, and he could not run so well as the other men. The sled charged down the slope, and the dogs curled up their tails and drew in the rumps as they scampered to get out of its way. The snow lay like a pavement of quartz, and no wind blew over its burnished white face. The sun hung pendant on the rim of the sky, and it was a cold, dying flame, though it stood at the peak of its rise for the day. Under the hides on the sled, the woman sat still as a dead thing, for she had no motions to waste in her struggle to protect herself and the children from the cold which beset them. Here's another drawing of one of the people. It doesn't say who it is. Now from a valley ahead there came the discordant wailing of dogs. Elikahu's team broke into a gallop, and the man leaped from the sled to run limping beside it, shouting the time-honored greeting of the Helmut at the top of his lungs. "Aija!" he cried. "Look up, you of the people, and see us, for we come from the right side of the ridge." And from the domes of 3 igloos, men and women crawled out into the thin light of day and waved their arms and shouted cheerfully at the newcomers. The dogs threw their necks against the thongs, and the big komatik bounced wickedly over the drifts, to be halted only when Elikahu jumped on the back and threw out the brake. This was a section of caribou antler, cut in such a way that its prongs could be pressed into the snow with one's foot and so bring the sled to a halt. The brother of the woman Kalak, whose name was Katelo, now dragged his sister from under the hides, and she rolled, shrieking happily, in the snow while her stiff limbs recovered their powers of motion. Her 2 children crawled out from under the robes and dashed for the entrance of an igloo, like rabbits caught in the open by hounds. A second man took the dogs and led them off to the picketing place, while Elikahu went with Katelo to a thick, packed bank of hard snow nearby. Here Elikahu thrust his long, willowy snow probe into the drift, feeling the firmness of the snow beneath. He tested, then he laughed with satisfaction and drew out his snow knife. The place was noisy with voices, for those in the camp had gathered to greet their eastern rivals. Onikawau's wife was shouting to all of them to come and eat in her igloo. Elikahu answered that his belly could wait, for there was work to be done. The rest of the people gathered under the low dome of Onikawau's igloo and heard the new gossip which was to be told. Meanwhile, Elikahu and his brother-in-law dug out a circular pit in the chosen part of the drift. Elikahu stood in this hollow while Katelo cut thin blocks of hard snow, beveled them at the top and bottom, and handed them to Elikahu, who used them to build the first circular tier of the wall. He began with one triangular block, and as his second row reached this block, it was slanted upwards so that the work formed a continuous spiral. It went very quickly, and as the tiers rose, the beveled edges of the blocks slanted them inward until a dome began to shape. In less than an hour, Elikahu stood under a dome and carefully trimmed the key block so it slid into place at the top of the igloo. When it was done, he took his snow knife and cut a door in the south side of the dome and crawled out to help Katelo stuff up the chunks with soft snow and to build a long arched tunnel of snow blocks away from the door. A high, keening sound in the air was growing steadily louder, and the 2 men hurried to finish their work. They built up the sleeping ledge that covered half the floor space of the igloo, and they brought in Elikahu's scanty belongings. The sun was now only a memory, and no twilight showed. Overhead, in the green shimmer of the aurora, flickered nervously, and the high, distant note of the blizzard grew louder. It struck with no warning of wind, except for a distant whine, but in the instant of striking it transfigured the land with a mad roaring of agony. The drifts which had appeared to be as hard as rocks they covered were scoured by the wind until they gave up sand-like fragments of snow, which whirled and cut at the 2 men who stood by the new igloo with their backs to the gale. White darkness closed in on the camp. The 2 men bent double against the wind and worked their way to the tunnel of Onikawau's igloo, and there they stripped off their outer garments and placed them in a niche. The broad sleeping ledge of Onikawau's home was crowded with people, for there were 3 families in the camp, and all 3 were there to welcome the family of Elikahu. There had been much drinking of cold soup and much talk, while the feeble fat lamp flickered from a ledge beside the tunnel entrance. But the best talk was yet to come, for Elikahow had driven for many days over the barrens from the camp of Hikwa, a great hunter, and he had a remarkable tale to relate. With a soup bowl of muskox horn on his lap, Elikahow settled himself on the ledge. Outside the igloo, the gale snarled and shrieked, but inside the gale was only a shadow, less than a shadow, over the minds of the people. There was talk, there was laughter, until after a while, Elikahow shouted, "I have a tale to tell!" And the many voices fell silent, and Elikahow's voice contended alone with the scurrilous fury of the wind's voice outside the igloo. "Well, now," he said, "that was indeed very good soup, as my belly will tell you." And he burped loudly to show that he meant. "And perhaps it is too good for a fool like me. But listen, for I shall tell you about this fool, Elikahow, who sits on the fine sleeping ledge of Anekahowow, and his wife." He paused and looked around the igloo, which was a sphere of darkness with a thick, white, luminous cover. He began, "You have all heard how Belikari, the son of Hikwa, found the black spirit of the air in the fall of the year that is gone? Well, I too heard the story from old Hikwa himself, but I have a powerful spirit of my own called Atin Huit, who looks more like a bear than a man, and who I always thought was stronger than any bird spirit could be. Now, when Keluk, this woman, my wife, and I decided to travel north to your camp, old Hikwa asked if I wanted the good wishes of Kaila, the god of all weather, to help us along. One does not refuse such a thing, so I asked Hikwa to speak to Kaila through the spirits he knows. But the old man instead called on Belikari, his son, to speak to Kaila for me. Being very much of a fool, I didn't think so highly of that, for Belikari is not yet a shaman like his father, old Hikwa. But I was a polite fool, and so it happened that Belikari was called to the task of his father. He stood in the center of the igloo, and he called loudly to the black one of the air, the raven, and after a while, he collapsed on the floor, and to my surprise, the great harsh voice of the raven came out of his throat, and it was called 5 times. I was a little afraid, but still I did not think the black one was as strong as Atin Huit, my own personal spirit. When Belikari recovered himself, he said that he had not spoken to Kaila at all, only that he had seen the raven spirit, and it had warned him not to travel out on the plains for the space of 5 days, else he would meet the great winds of Kaila, and he would not return to his igloo again. It was all clear enough, but then I am a fool. I thought that if the boy had not spoken to Kaila, then his spirit must have been weak. I trusted in Atinhuit, my spirit, and that very day we packed up and drove off to the north, though old Hikwa was angry when we ignored the words of his son. As we drove off, Belikari gave me a wing feather from the raven, and he told me that if I came into trouble, I should ask it for aid. And he passed his amulet belt under my arms and spoke to the sky, saying, "Watch this man who is blood of our blood. Speak to him in thy voice, which is as harsh as the rocks, if he has need. Come to his eyes and show him the way he must go, if he calls for your help." Then away we went northward, and we had traveled the lifeless plains for only a single day when we were met by the great wind of Kaila, as the raven spirit had said. We tried to make camp, but we could find no snow to fit for an igloo, and at last I turned the dogs out of the mouth of the wind and let them run straight before it, while we all sat on the sled to keep each other from freezing. But that wind was a real devil wind, and it changed its direction so many times that I, being very much of a fool, was quite lost on the plains. At last we were forced to make a rough camp in the lee of the sled, and here we hungered and froze for the 5 days of that wind. Really, I was frightened, for we had only a little food left. But then, when the storm at last came to an end, this woman here, my wife, remembered that the boy Belikari had said, and she told me to go stand on a hill and speak to the Black One and ask him for aid. I was frightened, so I went and stood on the hill, and I could see nothing, and I knew in all the land, and that made me more frightened. Atinhuit had not offered to help me, so I cried, "Listen, you black one of air, listen to the cry of a fool who is lost, and come from your place in the dark sky, and show him the way." There was no answer in all that land that was so still after the blizzard, so I turned and walked down toward the place where my dogs and my wife waited. But suddenly Kellogg screamed out to me, "Look over your shoulder!" And when I looked, there was a great black-winged raven, and it flew straight toward the horizon from the hill where I had stood. Well, we turned our dogs and we followed the way of the bird, and in 2 days we came over the little hills to your camps. And so you see what manner of fool is this fellow Alakahau. But not so much a fool that he will forget to give a small gift to the ravens when the deer again come to this land. After the story was told, everyone in the igloo spoke at length of the thing which had happened, and all were pleased with the tale, and many resolved in their hearts to give a small gift to the ravens when spring brought the return of the deer. Doninikwahau brought out his drum, and someone took it, and the singing began, and it lasted until the new day dawned feebly over the land. The gale was dead and forgotten, and the sun again hung coldly on the rim of the winter sky, and so the second day I tell of came to its end. Now that was the first winter Belikari trapped foxes all on his own, and his father had given him 5 traps to set where he chose. Since it was his first season as a trapper, he made his mistakes, and not the least of these was that he delayed too long in the late winter months and could not pick up his traps before the spring thaws had come to the land. It had been a bad winter. Before spring, there were deaths in some of the camps, though in Hikwa's igloo there was enough food for life. It had been particularly hard for the woman Iput, wife of old Hikwa, for in the time when food was the scarcest, she gave birth to a son who was the brother of Belikari. The birth was hard. Belikari watched it, and he was frightened, for he watched while woman grasped his mother's outstretched arms as she lay in her agony there on the ledge. He watched as the second midwife grasped Iput about her broad belly and forced the unborn one out of the womb. That's something I haven't heard of, actively pushing on the belly to force it out. Then there had been a month when Eput was unclean after the birth, and neither Belikari nor his father could enter the igloo at all. For a month, Iput could not be permitted to leave the snow walls of her prison, and all her food had to be prepared out of doors and brought to the mother and child in special vessels which no one else dared to use. The man and his son Belikari had known what real hunger was during that time, until the days suddenly changed and grew warm, and spring returned out of the south. Now the winter was done with, and on the third day of my story, Belikari had gone to reclaim his traps, to spring them and to cache them in high on the hills where he could find them when another winter had come. It was June when, as he walked over the long roll of the hills which lie to the north of the river, Belikari carried enough food for a week. That is to say, he carried a handful of dried meat. But it was enough, for already the birds were flocking into the plains, and the little streams of the muskegs were thronged with fat suckers anxious to spawn. This was the 4th day of Belikari's journey, and it had taken him that long to cover on foot a distance of dog teams in winter could have covered in half a day. There was a particularly rocky ridge which lay between 2 little lakes, and in this place the boulders were so huge that an igloo would have been dwarfed beside them. Winding among these great rocks were the trails of the deer, and it was beside these trails that Belikari had set some of his traps. There's a drawing of a youth. It's probably Belikari. If I do my normal way of having pictures for the backdrop behind me, I'm going to have 16 photographs and 2 drawings of individuals, as well as the chapter lead. I'm either going to have things very small, or I'm going to have to figure out some other way to include all the pictures. His sodden skin boots slipped on the rocks as he climbed the steaming slope of the sun-drenched ridge. Behind him, the wet plains wavered and shook under the heat waves. Green mosses flared on the boulders, and the lichens were thrusting their gray-blue fingers out of the gravel. Belikari came to his first trap and found it had been sprung. A wisp of white fur told him he had caught a fox, but the tracks on the sand showed that a hungry wolf had come past after the trap had been sprung. The second trap lay as the boy had set it. Now he tripped it, put it in his pack, and went on. Ahead of him, the great rocks had parted to form a deep gully, and as Belikari passed into its mouth, two big Arctic hares leapt from the darkness under a rock and fled like grey wraiths out of the sight of the boy. Belikari was angry that he had not been prepared for them, so he slipped his bow out of its case, fitted an arrow to it, and was about to go forward when the voice of the Black One spoke out of the warm silence ahead. The spirit spoke in the tongue of the bird, a harsh, terrified croaking, so charged with alarm that it needed no words to carry its message of fear into the heart of the boy. Belikari stood still for a moment and in the deep shadows of the canyon, and his heart raced like the heart of a hare in flight. He was frightened and unsure of himself. There was no doubt in his mind that the raven spirit had spoken to him, warning of a danger which lay in his path. But what danger? And what should he do? Was it the Inua, the ghost of the rocks, who lurked at the end of the canyon? Was it Paija, the one-legged devil who feeds on men's blood? Belikari had no way of knowing, and now he banked cautiously out of the rocky ravine the way he had come, and his muskox horn bow half bent and the arrow still held to the string. He backed out of the canyon, then he climbed cautiously to the top of one of the rocks, which hemmed in the dark gully, and from his vantage point he could see ahead to the exit of the ravine that had been hidden from view. He looked, and the blood coursed savagely into his throat, for there on the ridge, a stone's throw from where he would have emerged from the gully, was Akla, the great bear of the barrens. Akla, the frightful brown bear who towers twice as high as the white bear of the Arctic. Akla, the mysterious monster few white men have even heard of. Akla, the terrible, whose paw prints in the sand are as long as the forearm of a man. Akla, whose name is the best synonym for fear in the tongue of the people. He is rare, so rare that many men of the Ihamuit have never even encountered his footprints, and for that they are grateful. Yet in truth he exists, this grizzly bear of the barrens. Now Belikari saw him and recalled the tales he had heard of the fierceness of Akla, and now he knew that the raven spirit had warned him against. But with the foolhardiness of youth, Belikari drew back the gut string of his bow and let the thin arrow fly. The black spirit was indeed kind to the boy, for he made sure that the arrow fell far short of the brown bulk of the bear. And so Akela did not notice the puny shape of the youth on the rock, and he ambled over the ridge with a ponderous grace and went on his way, unaware of the boy. It was a full hour before Belikari dared come down from his rock, and he was trembling as he circled the canyon and came at last to the place where his third trap had been. It had been dragged from its anchor, and the chain that held it had been snapped like a twig of green willow. About it there was a ring of black feathers, and fresh blood smeared both the trap and the rocks. But of the trapped raven who had called out the warning, nothing remained but a claw and the upper part of the beak. This was the bird which had come to the bait Belikari had left for the foxes and had been itself trapped. It was the one which had cried out in terror as Akela approached, and Belikari had heard the warning and had not come suddenly on the bear as it fed. And so the boy lived, though the raven was dead. Belikari completed the trip to the last of his traps, though he was greatly afraid. He moved very quickly and did not linger long at his work. When the last trap had been found, he turned back, and if he did not quite run, he walked exceedingly fast. Yet he had time to stop and pick up the claw and bill of the raven, and to add these to the little amulet pouch he carried on the belt around his shoulder. He was still half a day's walk from the camp when he saw the ravens again, but this time he was not at a loss for their meaning, nor was he frightened, but instead he was wildly excited. They came out of the south like flights of black clouds, 200 ravens perhaps, in flocks of a dozen or so. They came steadily out into the north, flying very high in the sky. The leaders of the flocks tumbled and rolled like clowns at the head of a parade, and in fact these ravens were indeed leading a mighty parade. From a hill near at hand, Belikari watched the ravens swing by. Then he looked down at the hosts which were coming. Far to the south, the dun-colored face of the land was in motion. It rippled, not with the rise and fall of heat waves, but with the swaying backs of the deer. Forgetting Akla, his fears, and the winter behind him, Belisarius ran down the hill like a mad thing. And as he came in sight of the camps, he was shouting so loudly that all the tents rushed out to see what was the matter. "Tuktu Mai, they are coming!" he screamed, and those who heard him knew that the deer had again returned to the land. So the third day, the third memory, is brought to an end. These are only 3 days chosen from the thousands that have passed into story, and that are relived about the campfires which glow on the plains drained by the river of men. And these things which are of the past shall not be forgotten, while voices and memories still remain in that land.